Greetings and welcome to session 3 of the history of anti-Semitism. We closed with the expulsion of the Jewish people from the UK, and in the meantime we mentioned the Distinctive Clothing Act, we mentioned the teaching of contempt, so we're going to find ourselves now into the 13th century where Distinctive Clothing Act took place, but also other severe Jewish measures, such as the Council of Paris in 1212 that forbade Christian midwives to attend Jewish women, and also wet nurses and various other primitive by our standards but medical assistants at that time. But there were widespread retaliations, if you like, or punitive measures against Jewish people because of the teaching of contempt, largely. But by this time, after the Fourth Lateran Council, the Distinctive Clothing Act, Jew equals enemy of Christ, Jew equals enemy of mankind. And during the plague, it was felt that the wandering Jew, this assumed Jewish person that struck Christ across his face on his Via Dolorosa, was condemned to wander the world endlessly in eternal torment, and with him he brought a foul stench and the plague, and many sort of Jewish beggars were seized upon and put to death on the assumption they were in fact the wandering Jew. So round about this time, conversion sermons were brought in. These were brought in 1215, the Church Council by Pope Innocent III, Ordo Fraterum Predicatium, as they were called, and the Jews were compelled to listen to them. And James I of Aragon in 1242 enacted more enforcing legislation. From this time also various colloquies, which is a bit of a sarcastic use of word in my opinion, were called or debates between rabbis and experts in Judaism. Usually these were converted Jews themselves, and they were more, I don't even know there's a proper word for it, even though I'm supposed to be quite an expert on these things. I'd call it kind of auto-anti-Semitism, where Jews who converted turned violently against their own people, and they, when they convert, instead of receiving like a Holy Spirit, they receive a demonic spirit at the same time, or instead of, or something that masquerades of it. Reverend Martini or Reverend Martin was a quite famous forcer of these sort of debates to illustrate that Torah in particular was against humanity and against Christ and against the general well-being of mankind. And these conversion sermons really were forcefully, I'm going to say forcefully enacted, and children were taken away from Jewish families, particularly in the 14th century, forcibly converted and actually taken away out and put into other homes. So, in one sense, the whole idea of forced conversions was to remove the Jewish presence and then remove the threat. So, forced conversion occasionally would have a penalty of death that went with it, as we saw during we heard during our discussion on the First Crusade. But the whole conversion, and even forced conversion, should be really seen as a passive form of genocide, because the stated aim was to eliminate the Jewish people, and by conversion, if not, then as we know, as we've seen, then proto-genocides and destruction of Jewish communities was very common in the medieval period. Everyday kind of thing. The 1222 Convention of Canterbury forbid Jews from even walking on what was considered to be Holy Land. And that could be anything, whether Jewish people knew it was or it wasn't. So that was another thing that they had. Well, I suppose in one sense it was inevitable that Jewish people being expelled from everywhere or had to go somewhere. And if there was somewhere, and it was usually in the bigger places, that to be separated as a danger. So as a health and hygiene measure, this was the first institution, if you like, of the ghetto. There were numerous enactments separating Jewish people from the main communities, but the term that we use, expression ghetto, in its primary form, refers to the Italian word barghetto, small town, suburb, or quarter. Although it had been a common practice, the disastrous defeat of the Venetians by the League of Cambrai in 1516 saw the first institution of this, because the Venetians accused the Jews of being allies or plotters against them, and so on. So in the bull Comnimis Absurdum, issued by Pope Paul V, somewhere between 1559 and 1562, it was directed that all Jewish people should be placed on an island outside Venice that was known as Ghetto Nuevo, and it was basically a disused cannon factory. So the Jewish people on block were removed to Ghetto Nuevo, and the island was patrolled by security boats to ensure that they didn't get off that island. And the fee for the, what do you call them, maritime police, I suppose, to use a modern term, had to be paid for by the Jewish community themselves. So in a couple of 100, 250, 300 years, the Jewish people are now separated everywhere. They were wearing identified clothing, they're classed as pariahs, a danger to society, and any excuse that can be used to eject them physically, legally, or by death. Very, very common practice, I'm afraid. However, in my opinion, one of the worst, most dangerous, and horrific things, anti-Semitic attacks against the Jews, was the Office of the Inquisition. Yeah, the Spanish Inquisition, as it's generally known as. The Office of the Inquisition was instituted by Pope Gregory IX, following as a follow-on, if you like, from Pope Innocent III's declarations. And this was to seek out people accused of heresy. Now, heresy today has a slightly different take on what it meant sort of initially, because a heretic wasn't somebody who necessarily was teaching false doctrine. It was somebody who was basically considered to be a threat. And the Jews, of course, were threats. So it basically, following on from the Fourth Lateran Council, the office of the Inquisition was given to a newly created Dominican order for the purpose. And the idea was to investigate people who didn't hold the correct opinions about Christianity. Now, surprise, surprise, if you're a Jew, you wouldn't hold the correct opinions about Christianity. So therefore, by default, you were a heretic. And the way the heretics were dealt with was extreme in the smallest measure. So initially, because of internecine problems within the Church of Rome, the Dominican order and the Inquisition were set up to deal with Christian heretics, because there were many divisions, and those of you that have got any sort of interest in church history will know the East and Western church split of the Filioque cause. The papacy was split. The secular barons and the papacy were at war with each other. It was a complete and utter mess. So to try and get some sort of cohesion, the papacy raised the office of the Inquisition. But of course, it didn't take very long before the Jews became subject to all this too. So some of you, or many of you, may have heard of the great Jewish scholar Maimonides, who was a medical doctor, and an affair came around in the mid-13th century, known as the Maimonides affair, where Maimonides' writings were found to be heretical, if you like, and then this pushed the initiative against the Jews, generally speaking. By the end of the 13th century, the Inquisition, in what I would say probably popular imagination, had reached its maturity, and the public spectacle of the auto de fe was enacted in public places. So the Spanish Inquisition, now we've got to just sort of push a little bit forward on this, was established in 1481, and then the office became the most dominant element of the church. Instead of being a tool, it became particularly dominant in Spain, sort of leading the way with it. And once again, we have these deputations going on, these various arguments, and the church always wins. The Jews are found guilty of heresy, being heretical, and so on. In 1474, when the House of Castile takes over the Spanish regency, Isabella, who is quite notorious, was a fanatic Catholic, and greatly influenced by Alfonso de Hoya, who was the head of the Spanish leg of the Inquisition. And this was when specific measures against the Jews were enacted. They'd always been acted against, but this is when it became absolutely crystal clear cut that the Jews, in particular, were worthy of special attention. And if anybody was found practicing Judaism, which had by now become proscribed, if you didn't renounce your Judaism, you were over to the Inquisition to be tortured and burnt, basically. These series of enactments are really quite amazing. I'm just going to read these to you because my memory's not too bad, but I can't remember the list as long as this. So Bernard Gui, author of a manual for inquisitors. And the inquisitors, as you know, the actual inquisitors never shed blood because it's against Catholicism and the monastic orders to shed blood. So it's like burn people and so on, you know. And I think you all know what the vulgar impression of Spanish Inquisition's behaviour was like. And sadly, it's not far wrong. So Average inquisitor was given a manual, and these were the spot a Jew guides. Yeah, so you spot a Jew and you had a Minster Inquisition. But also they were very concerned about what they call Moranos, pigs, in other words. So I'm just going to quickly read these to you, and then we'll go over to our friends at Ezra. Tips for spotting Jews: the wearing of clean or festive clothes, clean shirts and headdress on Fridays, lighting new candles and new tapers on Fridays, cooking a double portion of food on Friday, eating food cooked for the next day on Friday, not eating on the first day of praying, Jewish fathers blessing children without first putting the sign of the cross on them, praying with your face turned to the wall, burning or burning nail parings, cutting away the nerve or sinew or the fatty portions of legs of beasts, covering the blood with ashes, cinders or earth, speaking out Jewish blessings over food. Good ones these, aren't they? After a drink being taken from a glass of wine, other people say sip from the same glass. Eating pork, hare, rabbit, strangled birds, conger eel or any other kind of eel, cuttlefish, not eating basically non-kosher foods, blessing children on a daily basis by laying hands on them, giving children Old Testament names, women not attending church up to 40 days after giving birth, somebody dying, turning the face to the wall, and washing a corpse with wall water, but most of all, not adding Gloria Patri at the close of reciting a psalm. Any one of these things observed by an inquisitor or a member of the public, because there were rewards for these things, remember, were subject to the Inquisition. So we'll return after our visit to Ezra.
Ezra International is a Christian nonprofit organization that helps Jewish people immigrate to Israel, or as they say in Israel, make Aliyah. Through your generous support, we are able to help Jewish people make Aliyah by providing one-on-one support for Jewish people in their home countries, completing in-depth ancestry research, by procuring necessary immigration documents, and finally, financing the immigration journey. Since 1995, Ezra International supporters have helped tens of thousands of people from around the world, and thousands are still waiting to return to Israel. God said He would be known by both the Jewish people and the nations when He restores them to their land. Your financial gift helps make that happen. Give now and be part of this great prophetic restoration process. Go to ezrainternational.org and give your gift of hope today.
From this very grim picture of the Spanish Inquisition, which we may say, without any shadow of a doubt, lasted for many years. It might surprise most, but certainly it didn't end. The Office of Inquisition didn't close to the mid-19th century. Well, in the late 15th century, with the Age of Discovery, and starting traditionally with Christopher Columbus, who himself was Jewish, and had a Jewish crew, largely the more skilled navigators, and they went to what they thought was the States, Cuba to start with, and the first man to set land on soil there was actually Jewish. And this was a result of trying to flee the Inquisition and before the expulsions, both in Spain and Portugal, 1490s, not 1490, 1492. The Sultan of Turkey, strangely enough, offered a home for Jewish people fleeing Spain during that time. But their fortunes didn't go too well when they went to Spain. But the Inquisition were very hot on the trail of the settlers in the New World. And the Inquisition went there to sort out Christian heretics, Jews, and also those that wouldn't convert under the conquest of the conquistadores. I mean, it was a torture and killing machine. So let's just go forward to the 16th century, and now we're going to look at the Reformation. Now, the Reformation traditionally starts on the 31st of October in 1517, when Martin Luther nails 92 theses to the door of the Marienkirche in Germany. Let's just have a little look first before that. The heresy idea and sort of destroying enemies was not new when Luther nailed his thesis to the Marienkirche door in Wittenberg. There had been earlier movements such as the Hussites and the Lollards, who've both been persecuted mercilessly, put to death. I'm sure most of you have heard of William Tyndale, the Bible translator, and he was put to death for daring to translate the Bible into English. But these are the days that they lived in. Well, Martin Luther is a very interesting person in his own right. Martin Luther was a monk. He belonged to the Augustinian canons. Now, Augustinians leaned very heavily on the teachings of Augustine, obviously. But what's very often neglected when discussions of Augustine come up is that Augustine started with the Manichees. Now, the Manichees were very black and white people, and they had two things: spirit good, flesh evil. Plain and simple, yeah? And Martin Luther, along with many ascetics and Augustinians, really kind of despised the flesh. And you can see that today in some things. I mean, the flagellant movement later on that destroyed many Jewish communities in Italy. You know, they used to get together in big bands and beat themselves with these cat o' nine tails with bits of bone and stealing until they'd broken bones and were bleeding all over the place. It was penitence for the flesh, and part of the penitence was to kill the Jewish people. But maybe we'll touch on them later, but I think time probably forbids. Martin Luther was very obsessed with sin and his own personal sin, and his confessor, Father Staupitz, got so fed up with him, with the amount of time he spent in the confessional, he said to him, "Dear Martin, please at least murder your father before you come back." Well, Martin Luther was very dissatisfied with what he saw the corruption of the church, and particularly the selling of indulgences. For those of you that are not from a Catholic background, you might not be quite aware of what an indulgence is, so let me elaborate. In this period, well, from the medieval period onwards, but even in this time, the time of the Reformation, people were far more afraid of purgatory than going to hell. You're expected to spend at least 2,000 years as a minimum in purgatory to meditate on your venial sins, and then so many odd 1,000 years for all your wrongdoing, so to speak. But there's a great idea that you could sell what's called an indulgence. You could pay so much off your years in purgatory. So there's a big campaign to build a new church in the Vatican, and a new campaign was raised for the sale of indulgences. So a preacher would come along, and there'd be a young boy banging a drum, and he'd preach a sermon about purgatory, and then you could get a certificate that you had so many years off. And the other way you could get years off in purgatory was by viewing relics. I'm sure what they are, like a saint's bone or something like this. But I mean, for instance, the church at Wittenberg, I mean, they had some pieces of straw there from the manger. Oh, these things, these viewing relics are amazing. You know, from what I've researched over the years, there's enough thorns from the crown of thorns, to crown a whole army regiment. There's enough of the true cross to build a small city, and so on. But the belief was that he got so many years off of this. So Martin was basically against this. So he nailed these 92 theses on Marienkirche at Wittenberg. Now, a thesis is not what we think a thesis in those days was a sentence, not a massive document, against what he called the Babylonian captivity of the church. And as you all know, strict reform followers still believe that the Pope is the Antichrist and the Church is the realm of Satan, and etc. Well, Martin Luther believed that now there's an alternative available, leave the Catholic Church, the Jews would now come to Christ because there was nothing to stop them. Because Luther sincerely believed it was the persecution of the Jews that had stopped them because of the doctrine of the Catholic Church. So he wrote a pamphlet, Christ Was Born a Jew, and it had no effect whatsoever. Now, Martin Luther was a very bellicose man, very bad-tempered, very vain and arrogant, and his language, shall we say, was always very colourful. And the other reformers along with him, if they didn't agree with him, they was basically rubbish stuff. The Jews didn't come to Jesus as he expected them to, so he wrote another book, The Jews and Their Lies. And he went on from there, and it makes terrible, terrible reading. I'm going to condense Luther's teaching concerning the Jews. We are at fault for not slaying them. We are at fault then. We're at fault for not killing them. And then he talks about how Jews should be put to forced labour. He talks about how the synagogue should be destroyed and Jewish people banned from teaching. There's a whole lot of this teaching. Time forbids. But for my mind, Martin Luther was one of the greatest anti-Semites of all time and is directly responsible for the Holocaust by his teachings. Now, Martin, the anniversary of 1517 in 2017 obviously brought a deluge of books praising Martin Luther for the Reformation and everything. However, I personally felt that it was time that somebody actually put the record right. So when the euphoria died down, I produced this book, The Dark Legacy of Martin Luther, which is available if you want to read it. And I just want to say that if you don't understand Martin Luther, you don't understand modern anti-Semitism, and you'll never understand the Holocaust. Many of the reformers, Jean Calvin, I'm sure you've all heard of as well, he had a very strange view of the Jewish people. And we can't really detain ourselves on that. But shall we say, he was quite happy to accuse the Jews of everything under the sun. And he was quite happy to have people put to death when he was the head of the canton in Switzerland that he was head of, including the early Anabaptists, Conrad Rebel, Fitzmounts, people like that. A man in Geneva called his dog Calvin, he had him put to death because of that. So you can imagine what his attitude to Jewish people was like. So the Renaissance, Martin Luther, not the Renaissance, the Reformation, was equally as bad for the Jewish people as it was previously. No improvement whatsoever. So we're going to finish here, and we'll pick up with the Enlightenment up until the modern period, and possibly we may even do session 5, shall we say, from post-war period onwards. But until then, it's been a great privilege and a pleasure with you. May God bless you.